9 terrorists who work for UNRWA were extradited to the international court after reviewing the evidence that showed that they were involved in the October 7 attacks. Is something I would very much like to hear, but that's not what happened. Instead, they were simply fired from their jobs, and that's it. So, as many of you know, we've talked about UNRWA many times. It's a agency specifically dealing with the issue of the Palestinian refugees. And they did start investigation about their own people, about their employees, and if basically researching if the claims are true that they were involved in the October 7 attacks. We talked previously about it that the first time they did it, they didn't find any evidence, but now some more things came out. Many Western media are commenting on this, although they are taking, let's say, a bit interesting angle when it comes to the disinformation and everything, and basically the information that UNRWA has released. Joining me today is James Valliant. Hey, James, how are you doing? And are you happy?
Well, it is an admission, and consider what an admission it must be. I mean, this is the UN policing itself. This is me asking, an arm of the people who did this crime to investigate the crime. So they have a bias, an inherent bias. Forget their wider bias that we know about, which is anti-Israel, on all manner of issues. We know what Guterres, the UN head's opinion is. It's anti-Israel. We know what the General Assembly, containing all those Islamic nations and dictatorships, think about Israel. And the thing, you say evidence, evidence. Where's the evidence in any of this? No one was, the way the New York Times covered it is 10 of those accused were cleared. And then they say 9 were fired. Well, if there's sufficient evidence to fire for being involved in the terrorist activity on October 7th, what we're talking about here, ladies and gentlemen, is an accusation, not merely of aid and comfort, which they do, the education of this evil ideology, which they do. We're talking about actual participation in the atrocities and the evil actions of October 7th, taking of hostages, keeping of hostages, helping people that were perpetrating October 7th or perpetrating October 7th themselves. So we're talking about UN officials through a UN organization officially participating in the atrocities of October 7th. Now, evidence. Where's the evidence? I mean, if there was sufficient evidence to fire them, please show us this evidence. Please show us the actual evidence of how UNRWA employees helped the terrorist atrocities on October 7th. And then they say 10 others who were accused were cleared. Well, what was the evidence of their initial suspicion? Was it they had no involvement at all? Or were they just not actual participants in raping and mutilating on October 7th? It's not clear because none of this evidence is coming forth. None of this evidence is discussed. They say how they considered evidence provided by the Israeli government, but because they didn't have direct access to it, they couldn't rely on it. Well, vague headlines about 10 people cleared doesn't do anything for me when it's the bad guys investigating themselves. Nor are they putting together the wider ideological picture. UNRWA schools have been teaching anti-Semitic violence, hatred, Hamas ideology, jihadism is the official stuff they teach. We have numerous evidence of this. We have the teaching materials themselves. They're teaching little children to martyr themselves in the glorious cause of killing Jews and destroying Israel and giving them all kinds of ugly racist propaganda about Jews in Israel and America, by the way, in official UNRWA education. So the official ideology of UNRWA is anti-Israel, is pro-Hamas, and they're not going to connect the dots here between people who may have sort of helped, people who may have aided and abetted, people who actually participated. I need to see that evidence. And the UN is not providing that evidence, nor is the media providing that evidence. What we do know is at least 9 people were actual terrorists who were working for the UN on the dime of Western taxpayers. Brits and Americans were paying the salary of these people who participated in October 7th. They are war criminals. You know, these international court, like you point out, these international courts of justice or international criminal court, they go after, they can send out arrest warrants against the leader of Israel, Netanyahu, as well as the leaders of Hamas. What about these guys? These guys are actual war criminals who should be put in front of international tribunals. But of course, they work for the UN, the same people behind these international tribunals, which shows you just how morally corrupt the whole thing is. All of these courts, all of these arrest warrants, unless we can go after UN officials for being terrorists and war criminals, the UN itself is a total joke and allows itself to pay the salaries of people who teach hatred, of people who teach the jihadist ideology, and people who actually either aid. And I mean, we don't, like I say, we don't know the nature of the evidence for those who were cleared, much less those who were fired. But fired for participating in October 7th, you started it perfectly correctly, morally speaking. These people should be in the dock for being war criminals, or in the dock for being war criminals. And guess what? The Labor government, ladies and gentlemen, has just refunded UNRWA, as if that's all we needed. Because, of course, they are the aid, they provide aid for this humanitarian crisis, which never actually seems to materialize in Gaza. But, you know, we here at ARCUK have been on this from the start, even before the UNRWA scandals about the way UNRWA schools teach Palestinian children, before the scandals about all these various employees of UNRWA actually helping or actually participating in October 7th. We were on this even before that became well known in the Western media. But well known in the Western media, it's still, the New York Times is still saying, in effect, 10 UNRWA employees were cleared. Not that 9 had sufficient evidence of actual participation in the atrocities of October 7th that they were fired. Show me that evidence. Put these people on trial for war crimes. Yes, sir.
Yeah. So first, I'd like to talk about something, because you mentioned that it shows the corruption when, in a sense, UNRWA or the UN investigates itself. And by default, I don't think that is something out of ordinary. You know, when you have the United States, when there is an investigation on when there is a corruption scandal, it's going to be the US, in a sense, investigating itself. But what you have to remember with these things, and similar, you know, when something happens, when let's say some Israeli soldiers are suspected of doing something that was inappropriate, Israel been investigated. But you always have to remember what are the goals. When the US investigates itself, or when Israel investigates itself, the goal is usually actually find the corruption. For Israel, they don't want soldiers to basically, let's say, just rape random people or go, in a sense, beyond let's say, beyond what is the standard for them. They have an interest in actually investigating itself. When it comes to UNRWA, does UNRWA have, in a sense, interest in stopping their involvement with Hamas, in stopping their, in a sense, indoctrination of the children? No, that is the goal. The goal of UNRWA is to perpetuate this conflict. The goal of UNRWA is to have the Palestinian refugees stay refugees forever. By the way, you also mentioned that the returning of the funding to UNRWA. So with the UK now returning, basically resuming the funding to UNRWA, this means that all nations besides US have resumed the funding to UNRWA. And again, the first time this came out was when we knew that when there was a possibility that UNRWA employees are involved in the October 7 attack. That's when Israel released it, and many nations have paused their funding. Since then, until now, when we actually have an official confirmation, nothing has happened since then. There was no development of the story since then. So nations slowly started resuming the funding with nothing changing, just time slowly moving, but no facts have changed. And now we have the fact that even by UNRWA itself, that the terrorists were, that the UNRWA employees were involved. Something else I'd like to say, I mean, the whole, while you were talking, I was trying to come up with an example to compare this something to, and I couldn't find one. The only thing I could think of, imagine, after 9/11, there was some whatever government, Germany just coming in and saying, oh yeah, some of our government officials were involved in the 9/11 attacks, but don't worry, we fired them. What do you mean you fired them? They these UNRWA employees were involved in a terrorist attack that, I mean, they took hostages, they raped people, they mutilated people, they killed many people, and you fired them? That's it? How is this anything close to a just resolution? If UNRWA is actually serious about their involvement, some sort of extradition, going to international courts or going to Israeli courts. I mean, I could get away even with the international courts. Rightfully they should go to Israeli courts, but I could get away with like just international courts. But not even that. They were just fired. That's it, for being involved in a terrorist attack.
Exactly. These are criminals. These are war criminals that we're talking about here, who were working on the dime of UNRWA, which all these nations have now started refunding. So think about that. The point I really want to dwell on that point you just made there. The reason why so many civilized nations initially withdrew their funding for UNRWA is because of these accusations. These accusations have, according to UNRWA and the UN itself, have at least encompassed 9 of their own employees. Not only is the problem still there, it's been confirmed by UNRWA itself in at least 9 cases. So the very reason why they withdrew the funding has not only not gone away, it's been confirmed by the perpetrating organization itself. So what has changed about that? Nothing has changed about that. Britain is now officially supporting Hamas. Britain is now officially supporting Hamas, an organization that has people that participated in October 7th, and all they get is fired. And any wider, whether we cleared 10 of them, because, their assistants may have been, minor or ancillary, forgetting, of course, that what they teach is terrorism. What they teach is violent racism. What they teach is the ideas that make October 7th possible. So no, they're not connecting the dots here at all. They just refunded them in the face of knowing that, in fact, at least several of them were actual terrorist participants. You're right, they're criminals. Now, of course, it's the UN itself and all of these international bodies lack any kind of moral legitimacy, and you can see it from this right here. But if they had any kind of credibility, they'd have to have some. See, in the United States and in Israel, we have mechanisms where the investigation of the government itself can be by an independent or a semi-independent body so that the public can have some confidence. As you point out, it is not in Israel's interest to have bad press go out about its soldiers. It's not in America's interest to find out that the government is something corrupt going on in Washington, D.C. So you have an independent investigation, an independent investigatory body look into it so that people have some confidence. What kind of confidence can we have in UNRWA's own investigation, which doesn't give us any of the evidence which tells us why people were suspected, who might have gotten cleared, or why people who were fired in this case for actual participation? And since they went through that sort of evidentiary weighing, and some people were worse than other people, it's that evidence that counts. And I want to know just what does it take to get fired from an agency that calls for the destruction of Israel? What does it take to get fired from an agency that has several people who participated on October 7th, and a whole bunch more, obviously, that are deeply sympathetic with it? No, UNRWA is perverse in a number of ways. It redefines what the refugees are, and it actually participates in the teaching of hatred and violence and terrorism. The United Nations, as an organization, covers up for terrorists, employs atrocity-committing terrorists. The United Nations, up to the firing of these 9 guys, and believe me, I don't think it's limited to these 9 people who were fired, But we now have confirmation that for many, many months, for many, many years, the United Nations had been employing terrorists, people who are advocating terrorism, providing material support to terrorism, and indeed people who commit terrorism. Terrorists are on the UN payroll, and Britain is happy to pay their salaries.
So I'll go to Super Chat. So you mentioned about the idea that they should release some sort of evidence. So, they've released a statement. UNRWA has released a statement, a whole 400 words document talking about basically going through the whole investigation. That's all we have, 400 words. So I'll mention that in a second because there were some interesting things there. But first, let me thank the super chatter. So we have a super chat from, or rather a super sticker from Bonnie. Thank you so much. A super sticker from Jonathan. Thank you so much too. Thank you, Wes, for your super chat, and thank you, Zoe, for your super chat. She's saying happy belated fifth birthday to Ariel, held by Monster. I believe that's one of the hostages, a child who has actually celebrated his or her fifth birthday. I think it's a boy.
Been a hostage longer than for most of this poor child's life has been a hostage. Think about that.
Well,
If the child is
fifth birthday.
Fifth
So
birthday. Oh, I was confusing. Yes. Well, think about that though. 25% of this child's life, 20% of this child's life has been a hostage. And when you look at those kind of statistics, ladies and gentlemen, look how long this has been going on. Months, and they're still hostages if they're still alive. Hamas is now negotiating over dead bodies. So I don't know, the release of dead hostage bodies is one of their bargaining chips in these things. So yeah, the whether or not the child is still alive is an open question in my mind. But think of it. A huge percentage of this poor child's whole life has been a hostage in some tunnel or some home from some Palestinian terrorists holding him. Think about that. That's absolutely inexcusable.
So people are saying his baby brother Kafir is actually the one who turned 1 in January.
Right,
so he
right.
did spend. Now he did spend most of his
Now
time.
think about both of those small children. I mean, it's disgusting, isn't it?
So so again, I mentioned 400 word release document where Lazzarini talked about basically this investigation, again, showing us that I think 20 people were investigated. No, sorry, 19. And basically, apparently there was no evidence against him or no evidence present or obtained. Just something to always remember is they didn't take any Israeli evidence into account since apparently they couldn't validate it. So all of this is basically, it is truly just their own research, or in a sense, their own investigation. But an interesting line in the document was this one paragraph, basically talking about sort of summarizing UNRWA, summarizing why they did the investigation, why they fired people. And it was, UNRWA is committed to continue upholding the fundamental principles and values of the United Nations, including the humanitarian principle of neutrality, and to ensure that all its staff abide by agency's policy on outside and political activities. So something that's interesting is there is that humanitarian principle of neutrality. Something to remember is when it comes to this war, when it comes to what's going on this war, UNRWA is the enemy. We've talked about this many times. By UNRWA basically being there and supporting their population, they are supporting, many of both Hamas members are in UNRWA. We've seen we've seen the direct ones. We've seen the tunnels under UNRWA headquarters, Hamas using UNRWA vehicles to get around. We've seen also aid that's supposed to go to UNRWA going to Hamas. We've seen all of these things. But even if there were just actual independent, there were no involvements with Hamas, they are still helping the enemy. They are still supporting the enemies of Israel. They are still supporting the people who did October 7, who crossed the border, who found the whole in defense and went into Israel just to butcher people. That was the only goal: butcher, rape, mutilate, do horrible things, and take hostages so they could get their killers back. That's what they did, and this is what UNRWA is supporting. So when you talk about neutrality, there's no neutrality in war. You are going to support some side, and UNRWA is supporting the side of Hamas.
Think about that. It is a humanitarian principle to be neutral in war? No. Would it be humanitarian to have supported Adolf Hitler when he invaded Poland and France and started setting up concentration camps? No. The humanitarian thing is to destroy Adolf Hitler and to take sides in a war. Now, as the United Nations, you could say, well, they do have this principle where they have to be neutral in conflicts between member states, right? And that sort of neutrality, which again shows the moral corruption of the United Nations. There is to be neutral in most wars is to be evil, is to be on the side of the whoever the aggressor or the dictator in that war is. But it's not just, we as objectivists can talk about the sanction of the evil in that broad sense, because any sort of neutrality, even if they were being honest about UNRWA being neutral, it would be evil, as you point out, sanction of the victim, evil. They're active participants. This isn't just a moral sanction. This isn't a passive, okay, well, we're going to be neutral about the bad guys versus the good guys, which would be bad enough, which would be corrupt enough. These people provide material aid. These people educate the young Palestinians in Hamas hatred. There is nothing neutral about UNRWA. They are ideologically committed to the side of destroying Israel. UNRWA is ideologically on one side, perfectly consistent, anti-Israel, pro-Hamas. They teach it. That's their official ideology. They teach children. They teach children. There's nothing neutral about it. So they're just lying, and there's no mechanism to catch the UN when they're lying about their own organization. So what we're looking at here, ladies and gentlemen, is an organization, an arm of Hamas, UNRWA, which is officially supported by the nations of the world. Thank goodness, still not the United States, but just give Harris enough time, she will refund UNRWA, because I'm certain that's the side she'd be on. And the civilized world is happy to fund because it has this, you see, United Nations sticker on the front of it, this United Nations label on the front of it, which gives it allegedly some kind of legitimacy, when of course it does the exact opposite. It is an illegitimate organization which actively supports Hamas and wants the destruction of Israel. There is nothing neutral about UNRWA. They are so unneutral that they will admit that at least 9 of their own employees had to be fired for participating in the atrocities of October 7th directly. So neutral? I mean, that's a joke. But neutral, even like you point out, neutral would be evil enough. These people can't even, the neutral ideas, well, that train left the station a long, long time ago. UNRWA and the United Nations actively supports Hamas, helps Israelis get killed, teaches Palestinians to kill Israelis. UNRWA is Hamas.
So just to extend and make people understand better the idea why the UN itself is evil, something to think about is, when it comes to civilized society, in a sense, you need to reach, I don't really like to use a compromise, because I think there's a bit of a problem when people use that word, but the consent, I think, is a word much better used. When I want to deal with James, we can only make a deal by consent of both parties. Let's say James has a watch I want to buy. I can only buy it if he agrees with it, if we agree on a price, if we agree on the terms. Once I pull out the gun, that's it. There is no longer consent. There is no longer agreement. So when it comes to international stage, you can only have, in a sense, relations when both parties, in a sense, so one point I forgot to mention, there is a certain underlying principle that allows consent, then in a sense allows compromise. So me and James can compromise on the price of the watch by basically agreeing that it's his, and if I want it, he needs to agree to it. Once that goes away, which on the international stage, many countries do not care. Most of the nations on earth do not basically do not have the same underlying principle. It is slowly disappearing in the West, which I find very disturbing, but there is still a sense of the Western sort of idea that the idea of some sort of individual rights. There is still some belief on the individual rights that the government shouldn't be able to take away from you. This is not shared by most of the nations. By the UN trying to, in a sense, find compromise between many of the nations, there is no compromise. Israel believes that it can exist. Hamas doesn't. Hamas believes Israel shouldn't exist. That's the whole goal of the organizations, not only of Hamas, but also of organizations such as Hezbollah, when we talk about just in the region. There is no compromise that can be reached between these two things, between these two entities, because they do not share the fundamental principles. And that is the biggest problem of the UN, in a sense, trying to find a compromise where there can only be, in a sense, compromise, and that's why I don't like this word, if one nation, and in this case Israel, gives up on its fundamental principles.
Right. There's no such thing as a moral compromise if you don't agree about fundamental principles. If there is no agreement about the fundamental principle or involved, there can only any deal guy can only hurt you. You're negotiating, the mere negotiation with evil at that point is to concede the entire case to evil, is to concede the entire case to evil. Iran yesterday said, how did they say we're going to get back at the Zionist entity? Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, does not recognize Israel's existence. They are an evil Zionist entity to be destroyed. Now, their participation in the United Nations, even though they refuse to agree with the United Nations principle that every member state has sovereignty to their borders and so forth, no, they can get away with saying Israel must be destroyed. We don't recognize them. We can do anything we want to them. That's the whole thing. You cannot negotiate with Iran. You cannot negotiate with Iran. Evil can only win when you negotiate with an organization that is, in principle, out to destroy Israel and eventually America if they can. They're, in principle, opposed to civilization. In principle, they oppose the existence of member states of the United Nations. The presence of Iran within the United Nations shows the total hypocrisy, and the moral perversion that is the United Nations in all of aspects, but in particularly evil, particularly egregious, because so far being morally neutral would be evil enough. They are active supporters of terrorism.
I think you summed it out pretty nicely. Sorry, you were cutting out towards the end. So we have a super chat from Jonathan. Thank you so much. He says, Miss Rand was right on the UN 50 years ago. It gives sanction cover for evil. And for that, I would recommend our other channel, The Briefly Objective. There is a video with James, which I think is called The United Nations is a Terrorist Protection Racket, which I really recommend. And in just about a minute, we have the reality show starting. We're going to be talking about the Britain's white jihadist riots. So we're going to continue the discussion from yesterday about the riots happening in the UK right now. So yeah. Thank you, James, for joining me today. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Link for the reality show is in the chat, and we'll be live there in just a couple of minutes. Thank you, James. Thank you, everyone, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.